This is contrast. I've got an orange in my left hand and an apple in my right hand. And these examples are contrast too. Progress does not come from the top down, but from the bottom up. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And it's fine to celebrate success, but it is more important to heed the lessons of failure. And this is what we do when we create contrast. You bring two seemingly different things together. First of all, I've got left and I've got right. I've got an orange and I've got an apple. Now they're two pieces of fruit, but they're quite different. We eat them in different ways. They have different colours. The orange is clearly bright orange, the apple is red-green, and they taste very different. And this is what we do when we create contrast. We bring two different things together, and bringing these things together creates depth, tension, and impact. Now you in your presentations, you can use contrasts at all different levels to create this depth and this tension and this impact. And if you do this, it's quite easy to do. It just takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of thought. You will create presentations that are much more striking. They gain attention, they'll be memorable, and in the end, you'll get much more success from these presentations. So let's look at how you can apply contrast, and we'll go from the global aspect, so the overall structure of the presentation, to the smaller elements such as words and phrases. So let's look at overall structure. Well, you can build contrast into the structure. For example, we looked in a previous video at creating a structure that has past, present, and future. Now this is contrast. The past, what's happening in the present, and predicting for the future. If I'm trying to sell something, I can talk about, first of all, disadvantages of the product, but I can make these disadvantages minor disadvantages and then contrast them in point 2 with lots of advantages and point 3 with many more advantages. In the same way, I can talk about failure and success. I can talk about disappointment followed by delight. So here I can talk about emotions, and I'm bringing in the contrast of emotions. So you could, for example, talk about the delight of success followed by the disappointment of failure. You could talk about a sad story followed by a happy story. You could talk about fear, and then you could talk about confidence. And I can also build in, or you can also build in contrast using visual information. So let's go through a few examples that I've just put together to give you some ideas of how you go forward. So here we've got the use of simple emojis. So using a happy face contrasted with a sad face. Or pictures that you can find of people, or pictures that you take of people. So frustration and happiness. Or here's a very clear contrast, a rich house and a poor house. You can use colours that contrast, so here orange and blue, or black and white. Or contrast with visuals here again, using both the image, thumbs up and thumbs down, which in itself is opposites, and different colours, so green and red. Or going into images such as talking about the size of an elephant, which is them, which is probably your competition in some way, and us, a small mouse. And this is a whole contrast and image that you could develop it throughout your presentation, talking about the elephant and talking about the small, nimble, competitive mouse. Or you can use contrasting images on the same picture. So here we've got fish swimming through a snowy urban landscape. Another idea that you can use with visuals is to set up a pattern with your visuals. So you've got a certain style for your visuals, and you've got visuals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the sixth visual has a completely different style and pattern and contrasts with the others. Now I'd like to come to using words and phrases within the presentation. And what I would like to do here is show you an example, and I'd like to come back to Steve Jobs' commencement address to Stanford University in 2005 and give you some examples of what he does in this presentation. Now, the whole presentation is about failure and success, and all the way through the presentation he contrasts failure and success. So he talks about his own failure with different aspects of his life, and then he goes on to talk about the success that follows this. But let me give you some other examples from the presentation using particular phrases that he uses in the presentation. So what's going on here? The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that look far more interesting. Well, what we've got here is clear contrast using opposites. We've got drop out and drop in. And what Steve Jobs does in the talk is to use this as a kind of mantra in one section of his presentation. And he keeps using this opposite, this contrast of drop out, drop in. And he uses this technique in other parts of the talk as well. But it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. So again, a simple opposite, looking backwards, looking forward. A phrase that I particularly like in the presentation is the heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. This contrast, something being heavy, it weighs down heavily on you, and something being very light, where you feel very free. And then another contrast that he uses towards the end of the talk is to compare death and life. And again, this is a kind of theme that he uses in the last part of the talk. So again, here's a couple of examples. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Death is very likely the single best invention of life. And a final example, contrasting old and new, it clears out the old to make way for the new. Now, what you might be thinking of at this stage is, well, that's all very well for Steve Jobs, or as we saw before, Obama or Bill Gates. But this is going to be much more difficult for me to use, and it's not a technique that I can use. But actually, you should think about using it. It just takes a little bit of thought, and even if English is not your first language, it's actually really, really easy to do, finding opposites. So linguistically, these opposites are not very difficult to find, and we find them in all parts of speech. They can be adjectives, they can be nouns, they can be pronouns, they can be verbs. But if you're learning English, then really these opposites, as I say, they're not hard to find. So just think about these for a couple of seconds. So if I say cold and I say think of the opposite, it's not difficult to find. Hot. If I've got give, I've got take. If I've got early, I've got late. If I've got love, the opposite is hate. If I look up, I can look down. If I look back, I can look forward. If I've got a truth, I've got lie. If I've got day, I've got night. And so on and so on and so on. Even as I used in the first example, I've got left and I've got right. So why do these opposites work? Well, they're a clear contrast. If I've got opposites, I've got cold and I've got hot. They're at polar ends of the spectrum. Now, taking the examples that I've just given to you, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples that I've put together using these examples, and to show you that for you to do this, it's not, as I say, it's not really difficult. So I've used in the first one, dark and light. We are coming out of the dark of the long development phase into the light of the full implementation. Love it or hate it, We sold millions and the product is still a cash cow. Give your best and take the rewards. And another phrase that works very well in English is to use the words not and but. So if I say it's not this, but it's that, I'm immediately setting up a contrast. I've got two different things. And again, I'd like to show you a couple of famous examples. And the first one is from John F. Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Again, this is creating contrast, and there is the use of opposites here as well with not and but. There's a double effect with easy and hard. Another example, this is from the business writer and commentator Peter Drucker. So the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself, but to act with yesterday's logic. And Martin Luther King, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Again, using not and but, and then this brings in the opposites with enemies and friends, this double effect. Again, we've got famous people here using this technique, not and but again, I'd like to show you that this is not difficult for you to use, but it's very, very, very easy. So let me show you some examples that I've just written. So success does not happen overnight, but takes years and years. And then taking the opposites that we've just seen, easy and hard, it is not the easy path, but the hard path that will get us success. A is not the best option, but B is. Another thing that you can do in the presentation is when you're describing things is not just to use the simple form of the adjective, so cheap, but to use the comparative form of the adjective, so cheaper. Now, I don't have to mention the other thing. If I say this product is cheaper, then there is immediately a contrast. The cheaper is comparing the product probably to products made by other people or made by the competition. So again, if I take a phrase like, if I say this product is good, fast and cheap, this is okay, it's quite effective. But if I just change it by using comparatives, then I can set up contrast. And this is an effective technique. So I can say this product is better, faster, cheaper. So these are some examples of how you can use contrast in your presentation, from overall structure to bringing in contrasting emotions in your presentation, using visuals with contrasting effects, and using opposites, not, but, and comparative forms. So this brings us to the final question. So why does contrast work? Well, I would mention three things for you to think about so that you can think about using contrast yourself. And the first is, again, it's historical reference. We can go all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans, and when they talked about rhetoric, they talked about contrast and using contrast. If you use contrast, what happens when you use contrast is that the listeners have to begin, or their brains begin to work with the two things that are being contrasted. Orange and apple, for example. What my brain does is when I think about the apple and the orange, it begins to put the two things together and think about how the contrast works. It's like a puzzle in some ways. Now, if I'm doing this and I'm thinking about the presentation, well, this means that I'm paying attention and I'm listening to the presentation. I'm beginning to process the information that is being given. Now, if the people listening to your presentation are processing, this is a really good thing because they're processing the information, and if people process information, you've got a much better chance that they will go on to the next stage of listening, which is remembering, and you're going to give a memorable presentation. The last point I would give about contrast is, again, it's one of these techniques that if you use it and you use it effectively and it's relevant to your presentation and you use it creatively and with imagination, what you begin to show is that you really care about the presentation. It's that you've given thought to the presentation and you've really begun to think about things that will put across the information. Now, this will help you to stand out. It will show that you're really caring about your presentation and that you're managing the presentation, and this will leave a really positive impression. So that was it for this video. It was all about another technique, which is contrast. I would encourage you to have a look at my other videos on giving presentations, and please like this video if you liked it. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much again for listening.